So our next speaker is Dr. Rochelle Marrinan, who is an associate professor and former chair of the Department of Anthropology at FSU. She's had a distinguished career, received her PhD from the University of Florida, and in 2013, Rochelle received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southeast Archaeological Conference, awarded for excellence in the study of archaeology. Her talk today is going to be presented on the cultural and religious adaptations of the missions of Northwest Florida.
Well, I want to thank the organizers of this conference. I've attended a number of these conferences over the years and always come away knowing that it was well worth my time. So this morning I'm a filler for a colleague who could not attend, and so you won't be hearing about food from me, although I do understand that I stand between you and lunch. So I will be merciful. All right. First of all, I want to remind us about the mission systems in Florida and point out to you that even though when we think about Spanish missions, we think of California, Alta California, Upper California is relatively late. Florida really has the earliest missions in native North America, and while the Jesuits were unsuccessful, the Franciscans basically ran the system for quite some time. This is the way the state, well, the area of Florida looked around 1675 when Bishop Calderon made his visit to all of the missions. You also can see 3 missions that are out in that area. Those are very short-lived missions that Calderon himself set up, but given their distance from Apalachee, they only lasted 2 or 3 years. So this area, central area, right here, right there, is the primary area of interest to us. At the height of missionization around 1675, we have 14 named missions in Apalachee province, from the Osceola essentially to the Occolocny or slightly beyond, west of the Occolocny. So I want to go over a few dates here that give us some background to understand the kinds of changes that occurred during this time. So one of the problems we have is that we really don't know terribly much about the Apalachees during a period of time that's almost a century long, really from the time that Narvaez comes into the eastern side of the province, and of course 11 years later Soto comes through. And then what happens between then and 1633 is not well documented, so we just don't know a lot about what kinds of accommodations or adaptations the Apalachees made to this changed world of the Southeast. It's not so much what happened to them necessarily, but there were others on their periphery who were very much changed by contact with Europeans. So in 1608, we have the first documented contact with the Apalachees by a Franciscan who was working across the Osceola in what is called Ustaga, or among the Ustaga, a Timucuan-speaking group, with whom the Apalachees had hostilities that were actually documented by the Soto expedition. So Prieto comes across the river. Essentially, he meets with 70 chiefs in the town of Ivatachuco, and he reports that he settled this war, all the hostilities really between the Ustaga and the Apalachees, allowing the Franciscans essentially to come and go as they needed. The chiefs at this time of Apalachee requested that friars be sent to them. In other words, they were looking for a closer alliance with the Spaniards, and we don't precisely know why, but I think by the early 17th century, they realized that the Spaniards were here to stay and that they had things and arms and things of that sort that interested them. And in Mississippian times, in pre-contact times, the display of exotic goods was one of the things that, that we see. And I think that's one of the things that really interested the chiefs particularly. So they requested friars. They sent the chief's nephew, the paramount chief, sent his nephew to render fealty to be baptized, and that is kind of the beginning. But 25 years pass, and the friars don't come until 1633, and they come from Ustoga. They come alone. They're not defended by soldiers or anything of this sort, and they establish at least 7 missions, perhaps 8, in that time. The first mission list we have is 1655. There may be earlier ones, but that's the earliest that we have at this time. In 1647, there is a rebellion in Apalachee, and they burn the missions. Now, how much of the missions are burned, we really don't know. But apparently the churches are burned, because it is said that they are reestablished within the year very, very rapidly. As a consequence of their actions, 12 of their chiefs, who were considered to be ringleaders in all this, are hanged, and another 24 plus are sent away from the province and sentenced essentially to hard labor for the rest of their lives. Another notable thing that happens is the movement of the mission of San Luis. Now, the first mission is probably located in Myers Park and also on the grounds of Capital City Country Club. A survey that was done when the Martin de Soto site was found in the middle 80s showed that, in fact, there were materials in both of those areas that seemed to be mission period in time, but no further work has been done on that. So, the thing that happens that's going to change everything is the founding of the Carolina colony, Charlestown colony, in what is today South Carolina. These are planters from Barbados who got permission and all the patents and things that they needed to form a colony in South Carolina. The first decade is not too bad, but they begin to encourage native groups that are in their area to slave raid, to produce slaves. And those slaves are, Indian slaves essentially, are sent to the Barbados and other places in the West Indies. 5 years after the founding of this colony, Governor Hita y Salazar in St. Augustine decides that he has too many hungry mouths, and so he moves Spanish families to the province. This is really the beginning of the end, in a sense, for the Apalachees. Of course, there are international conflicts that are going on between Spain and England, particularly sometimes Spain and France and England, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's on what side. But in any event, these international conflicts also bring problems for the Apalachees, for which they have really no say in. This Indian slave trade that's begun by the Virginia planters begins to really be accelerated by the Carolinians, and as a consequence, we start to see serious slave raiding around 1680, with some tribes or some groups of native people really just becoming professional slave raiders, and actually no longer really hunting or planting, but now living off the proceeds of the slave trade. So in essence, in many ways, the planters of South Carolina sold Indian slaves essentially to get funds to buy African slaves. In the 1690s, we have to say that San Luis was actually a Spanish town. And today, for example, when you visit, it's identified as a Spanish town in 1703, just before the final abandonment of the province. And that's the way the site is interpreted. But the reason it becomes a Spanish town is the Spaniards displace the Apalachees. They take their homes, they expect them to work for no pay. They're particularly tough, and as a consequence, the Apalachees would vote with their feet and live a league away from them in the woods. But that also means that the mission function is no longer present at San Luis. It's now a Spanish town. So we have the final raids in the 1700s, the early 1700s, basically, 1702 to 1704, and the ultimate abandonment of the province in 1704. So in 1608, who are the Apalachees, in a sense? How are they living, and what would we see? We think at the outset of missionization, they retain a lot of their previous pre-contact ways of life, that they are matrilineal and they are matrilocal also. Anthropologists look at the kind of social organization we see in many of the late pre-contact sites in the southeast. They would be Mississippians, essentially, and they hang on to that for a time. So we have a chiefdom, essentially, here, with a paramount chief living at Iva de Chuco, his nephew generally at San Luis, and a ranking of lesser chiefs. Now, how many were there? Good question. There was never a census taken. So our understanding of how populous Apalachee was at the outset of missionization is questionable, let us say. I've seen estimates of 30 to 36,000 in 1608, and I've also seen many lesser numbers as well. But the truth is, I don't think, knowable. The Apalachees were Muskogean speakers. The people across the river, across the Osceola, were Timucuan speakers. The Apalachees looked to more northerly and actually more westerly in the area around Mobile for trade and relatives and things of that sort. We know that the Apalachees were really fierce in their defense of their homelands because of the narratives of Narvaez, and also for the Soto narratives, of which there are, I think, about 5 now. They had trading relationships, apparently extensive trading relationships with other southeastern groups, but there was this long-term hostility looking east, and that was one of the things, of course, that I've mentioned already that the Franciscans had to deal with. Now, these were agriculturalists, they were sedentary, they had a primary crop of maize, which of course is going to attract the attention of the Spaniards in San Luis and in St. Augustine, because St. Augustine is always short on food. Just because they were agriculturalists didn't mean that they didn't hold territory in which they hunted and also in which they collected plant materials for both medicinal purposes and for food. However, there are things about them that we don't know very much. One is their religious beliefs, and of course, religious beliefs become a rather important element of concern or discussion in missions because, you know, they're being converted from one religious system to another as the missionization process goes on. So we don't know specifically what their religious beliefs were because no one has ever written that down. However, we do know that probably, like so many other native groups, they were polytheistic, probably sun worshippers, and their religious practitioners would have been shaman and curers, basically, sometimes male shamans, sometimes women curers, basically. And we don't know precisely what their burial practices were, and I'll come back to that fact. The paramount chief of Apalachee was at Iva de Chuco, the first village that you would first Apalachee village that you would come to on this side of the Osceola. Now, the leadership of Apalachee social life is not well known. We make a lot of assumptions based on knowledge from other places. One of the things that is very interesting is that the Franciscans report in their chapter meetings that the Apalachees are really interested in having the Franciscans come because, and the Spaniards come too, so that their retainers will obey them. And it's not really clear precisely what that means. Whether the Apalachees have kind of leadership by charisma and other kinds of things, but not coercive force. The Franciscans chose the San Luis location, I think, because, first of all, there was knowledge of Anhika Apalachee, which was the town that Soto took over for almost 6 months. But I also think it positioned them on the western periphery, or toward the western periphery of Apalachee, and they intended to go further west. So my real concern is that the Franciscans and the Spaniards in general might not have understood Apalachee's sociopolitical organization and the way it worked. These folks were matrilineal, matrilocal. The people who would have come from Spain would have expected patrilineal, patrilocal, and patriarchy, essentially. And of course, you know, they made their pledges of fealty to divine right kings. They often called the chiefs here kings, and I don't think they really understood that the relationship was not quite the same. So chiefly offices were really important. Chiefs were able to have privileges that others didn't have, and many of those privileges were retained when the Spaniards extended missions into this area. So I want to return to burial practices. In pre-contact times, from archaeology, we know that the burial practices were varied. Now, as Mississippians, we would have expected the folks who were here, whether they were Apalachees or somebody else, to use mound burial. And we have Lake Jackson up the road with 6 or 7 mounds. Now, only one has been seriously examined, and that was during a salvage project by Calvin Jones in the late 1970s. Unfortunately, we lost that mound almost in entirety. But we do know that there were different kinds of burials, some with sumptuary grave goods, a lot of things that tie Lake Jackson to the Mississippian world, in the greater Southeast. Now, were the Apalachees, or the people who become called Apalachees, were they burying at Lake Jackson at the time that Soto showed up? The answer is we don't know. In some areas in the Southeast, it seems that these big mound complexes are being abandoned. Their population is certainly lessening prior to contact, so it's not clear that this is going on here. We honestly don't know. But a lot of people feel that because the narratives here don't mention mounds, although they don't mention mounds in a lot of places in the Southeast, mean that the native people here were not using those mounds at the time. Our knowledge of Lake Jackson is so limited that it's very difficult to say how long those mounds were in use for burial. But you also don't reveal your sacred spaces to your enemies. And there wasn't warm and fuzzy feeling between the Apalachees and Soto's Spaniards either. So who knows? What we do see in the missions is that the congregation is buried beneath the floor of the church, which is more of a European custom, but it also might be the extension of something like mound burial or burial in a sacred space to burial in a new sacred space. This is one of the ideas that Gary Shapiro, who was the first director of archaeology, proposed essentially for why everybody was located beneath the church floor. We have seen a few exceptions, and I'll talk about some of those, but this is the Lake Jackson site, which I'm assuming all of you have buried. This is Mound 1, taken from Mound 4, pretty much, or the vicinity of Mound 4. Again, we don't know terribly much about Lake Jackson. So now looking at accommodation and adaptation, what do they have to adapt to? Well, lots of things. From dress, the Apalachees apparently didn't wear a lot of clothing, but in a good Spanish village life, or becoming a good vassal of the King of Spain, one wore clothing. And so clothing becomes one of the things that is introduced. When Calderon comes in 1675, apparently some of the women are topless. He puts them in these sack dresses, which would probably have been very difficult to get around in. But anyway, the reality is clothing is one of the things that becomes important. Polygamy is no longer allowed. Chiefs could have more than one wife, but now not. And so figuring out the legitimacy of children from second and third or fourth wives becomes a very important aspect of whether this is a legitimate child and therefore can inherit, or whether it's not. So we have the imposition essentially of a kind of a different inheritance system in a way. We see, of course, the daily, the seasonal, and the annual round very much change with regard to religious practice. There are mass, the daily mass basically, there are feast days, and there are holy days of obligation, which require you to be present. There's confession. There are a lot of new things that are imposed. Now the friar is an interesting person because he's generally a Spaniard, at least the ones he served here. And he's alone. In some instances, there are two friars in missions, mostly at San Luis, but in the outlying missions, the ones I've worked in primarily, there's one, and hundreds of indigenous people. And sometimes, as before in 1647, they're murdered, basically. There are real difficulties for them. But he becomes also a spokesman for the indigenous people for whom he's responsible. And almost every mission, named mission, basically has several satellites or visitas, basically, that he's responsible for. So hundreds of lives, basically, usually for one Franciscan friar. The Apalachees had trading relationships with other native groups, and a lot of these became problematic over time because as Britain, the British subjects, basically Carolina, influenced many of the other native peoples in the southeast, and they became slave raiders. The governor would basically forbid certain kinds of trading relationships with certain groups, and this really affects the relationships that indigenous people have with one another, and also causes a lot of strife. St. Augustine always depended on Indian satellites, essentially, to assist with food production. And once Apalachee opens up, it's a real bread basket. St. Augustine is dependent on something called the situado, which is a dole, essentially, from a more prosperous area like Puebla or Veracruz, sending supplies, essentially, to St. Augustine. And some years it comes, and some years it doesn't show up, and a decade can pass before ships show up. So always hungry, apparently. Now, one of the requirements also was that the Apalachees plant a sabana, a field, a maize field, essentially, for the support of the friar. The maize field oftentimes produced a surplus, and they would use that surplus to get things to embellish the church, the parish church, or they would sell it to the folks in St. Augustine for credit for other things in future. So sacraments are also imposed now. Formal marriage and baptism for legitimizing offspring. No longer is inheritance, well, how shall I put it? No longer is lineage as important for legitimacy as being married, essentially, and entered in the parish records. But matrilineal kinship does continue to be the basis for chiefly office. And there is evidence that matrilocality was maintained by the Spaniards. I want to mention the labor issue. The Spaniards were always in need of labor. And as the people around them diminished in number from epidemic disease, Apalachee out here, 2 weeks away on foot, was spared a lot of this early epidemic disease and population loss. After the rebellion in 1647, though, the Spaniards of St. Augustine imposed repartimento on the Apalachees. And so the chiefs began kind of labor brokers in determining which men would fill the labor levy for a particular season. So men of working age, essentially, were removed from Apalachee and went to St. Augustine, and they might be dispersed from St. Augustine, or they might work on the local fortifications, or they might plant fields for the soldiers. There were a lot of different tasks that they did in St. Augustine. Carrying burdens of maize, basically 70 pounds or so on your back, along with your own food and your own weapons and things of that sort, to St. Augustine for a 2-week trip was really tough, and probably one of the absolute worst assignments that a man could have. So I also want to look at a little bit about what we've learned from the archaeological materials, because mostly what I've said has been available to us through documentary research. But we've been humbled, I think, as archaeologists in dealing with mission sites, because they're large. They include many acres because of the need to intensify agriculture. We've looked primarily at the complex of structures, the church, the convento, basically, and other structures right in this kind of mission core. But we don't really understand how the Apalachees were living on the landscape, whether they were nucleated or whether they were more dispersed. Our assumption right now is that they were more dispersed in a kind of Mississippian fashion, and this also helps to intensify agriculture if you have a lot of folks out working in fields. One of the things we've also learned is that a lot of the interpretations of early excavation, which were extremely limited in scope, have been pretty premature, and also that the earliest look at missions here had a definite California slant. And I show you this picture. This is one that actually Mark Boyd drew himself and was published in the 1951 Here They Once Stood, The Tragic End of the Apalachee Missions book that he put together with 2 archaeologists, Hale Smith and John Griffin. A kind of rotund friar, and so the fundamental question for me when I first started working on missions was this. The Franciscans were a mendicant order. They were an order of preachers, and they gathered alms from the people whom they preached to, and they did good works. So this is, in essence, the way the order worked. Now, when they came into the New World, they were given responsibilities for social engineering that they never had in the Old World. But because we can see regularities in the footprints of structures in Arizona and New Mexico and other places, is there a Franciscan plan that gets pretty much engineered everywhere they go? Do they have an idea of how it should be? So my question to myself and to the literature as it was in 1984 when I started working on missions was, were the Florida missions built to a consistent plan? And we'll look at that. So these are sites that have received archaeological investigation. Many of them, I would question identifying them specifically as a mission because we have never found the churches, found other structures. So this is a New Mexican mission. This is Gran Quivira, and you can see that the church basically is a long thing. It's a long hall church called a single nave church, and this is very good for preaching. The mendicant churches of the Franciscans and others were very unadorned for the most part. And then next to it is a convento. And here we also have the convento sharing a wall. This is a mission that's built of stone. This doesn't work very well in missions that are built of flammable materials, as our missions are. So we have individual structures that are separate from each other. So this is the mission cemetery and actually the location of the church at San Damian de Cupaica, which is the last position essentially of the Escambay mission, just north of San Luis, about a cannon shot away, it said. This is Calvin Jones's map from about 1970. And while Jones thought this was a discrete cemetery away from structures, you can see those little red dots, and they are posts. And this is burials inside a structure, which was not really understood at first. This is his excavation, at least part of it. This part right here, from 1971 at Mission Patali. If he had opened up a little bit more, he would have understood that he had the nave, but he didn't have the sanctuary area. This is the San Luis mission plan. Now, this mission was built in 1656 and 57, so it's a middle, and it lasts for a long time, so we can see this. Here, the church and convento are around 30 to 34 meters in space. There's a big intervening area there that we know very little about. There's a covered way to a third structure, essentially from the convento, that probably is for cooking and storage and other kinds of functions. So that, to me, is the late plan. And here at the O'Connell site, we have the same kind of plan, the convento kind of uppermost middle, and 32 meters away, the church wall. Now here we have burials inside the nave, as we do at the other churches, and also slightly outside the main door in a kind of campo santo. But then we also have a lot of burials outside the drip line, basically, of the church on the southwest side, basically, on the northwest side, and a large intervening area as well. And a third structure, possibly, which we did not get to finish before the land was sold. So I think in the late missions, we can see a particular plan. In the early missions, I think they come into an extant village, and as a consequence, they have to kind of work their way, or their structures, into an already established group of structures. And so they have much less room to work. So this is what it looks like in the ground, and you can see that it is very close to the surface. This is the 17th century surface, essentially. Those are paper plates that mark the outline of the structure on the northeast end. So, minimally, an archaeological criterion for a mission is finding the church. Then you know you've really got one. And to do that, you also are finding the cemetery with the congregation, essentially. There are other kinds of structures, but I think that confirmation of a mission really depends on that. We've worked at the Castro site, 8LE151, and we have yet to find any sort of, we have structures there, but we don't have a church yet, so I'm not calling it. All right, so we have a little material change too. We know that the Apalachees accepted a lot of material goods, and some of them help us a great deal with determining early and late. This is a suite of early mission period beads. These are the ones we see in the earliest missions. Mission Patali, for example, has these. And these are late polychrome majolicos, or mahalicos, however you want to say it, that help us identify late sites. So we can do early and we can do late. The middle is somewhat difficult. I also want to just mention the ball game, which is a very important aspect of Apalachee life, but it was a brutal game with many injuries, and it also had these polytheistic, sun-worshipping kinds of attachments, which worried the Franciscans and began to worry the Catholic converts as well, and so sometimes it was forbidden. Raiding, oftentimes the militia at Indian militia basically at San Luis assisted the Spaniards with some sort of action against raiding groups. Most of the mission period, they used bows and arrows, but late in the mission period, the Apalachee militia was actually issued firearms. But I want to point out that the inventory of firearms out here is antique. You know, these weren't modern or new things. There were arquebuses and things like that go back really a long time. The defenses of San Luis are of interest to us too. When San Luis was moved from Myers Park out to its current location, the Apalachees agreed to build a blockhouse that would house a small detachment of militiamen. They did this. And ultimately, as things got hotter and hotter, they also built a palisade, but those were in the very late years of the site's existence. So the palisade wasn't built until the threat really comes in the late 17th century and early 18th century. But all of these structures were pulled down and burned, basically, as the Spaniards abandoned the province. So in 1704, we have the last raids against missions and the loss, essentially, of the province. There is never any real resurgence of mission activity in this area, although they would like to have done that. It just wasn't going to happen. So the Apalachees now become refugees. Some of them, it doesn't seem to me that the Spaniards cared terribly much what happened to them at this point. But some of them, like Don Patricio de Hina Chuba, who was the paramount chief of Apalachee from Iva de Chuco, bartered basically the life of his congregation for the church plate and, you know, the wealth that they had with the British Carolinians, essentially. And so they left and went toward St. Augustine only to be killed in subsequent raids. Many of the people at San Luis fled west, first to Pensacola, which was not enticing at the time, and then on to Mobile to live in the Petite Nations with other displaced groups as well. So from being an autonomous group of people in 1608 or even in 1633 to being dispersed refugees, essentially, and displaced people, there's a great deal of adaptation that occurs, a great deal of accommodation, and at the very end, there is very definite abandonment. Thank you.